Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you feel like you are not quite yourself, or why your sense of who you are can shift depending on the situation? Well, this new study looks into just that, and it is fascinating stuff. Today we're diving into a paper that is all about understanding the self, not as a fixed thing, but as something that is always changing and moving, like a dance that each of us choreographs uniquely. Think about it. We all have a sense of self, right? We know who we are, generally. But that feeling isn't always the same. Sometimes you feel confident, sometimes insecure, sometimes you are really focused, other times your mind wanders. And importantly, how you experience yourself can be different from how someone else experiences themselves, even in the same situation. This paper says that traditional studies often try to find one single big answer that applies to everyone. But what if the most interesting stuff happens within each person, and how that changes over time and in different situations? The researchers here are proposing a new way to look at this. They call it an idiographic dynamical framework. Let's break that down. Idiographic means focusing on the individual as opposed to nomothetic, which means looking for general laws that apply to groups. Dynamical means constantly changing, not static. So they want to study the individual and how their sense of self changes. They believe that if we only look at averages across lots of people at one point in time, we miss the really important personal story of how our self-experience actually works moment by moment. They're drawing a lot from fields like phenomenology, which is all about first-person experience, and enactivism, which sees ourselves as actively interacting with the world. These ideas help them argue that our sense of self isn't something in our brain that we just access, but something that is lived and experienced through our actions and our engagement with the environment. It's always in progress, always adapting and relating to what is happening around us. So, their big goal is to create a framework, a way of thinking and doing research that can actually capture this dynamic individual experience of selfhood. They want to move beyond just measuring traits or characteristics that stay the same. They want to see how the connections between different aspects of our inner world shift and change. One idea that really helps understand their approach is the pattern theory of self. Imagine yourself isn't a single object, but a complex, evolving pattern. This pattern is made up of many different parts or dimensions, like your sense of agency, feeling like you are in control of your actions, your sense of ownership, feeling like your body and thoughts are yours, your sense of continuity over time, and your narrative identity, the story you tell yourself about who you are. These dimensions aren't separate boxes. They're all interconnected and influence each other. The pattern theory suggests that a healthy self is like a flexible, well-organized dance between these dimensions. When things go wrong, when the pattern gets disrupted, that's when we might experience self disorders, or what some call anomalous self-experiences. Now, here is where the science gets a bit technical, but it is super important. A lot of traditional psychology assumes something called ergodicity. That is a fancy word for saying that what is true for the average person over time is also true for any single person. Think of a river. Its average flow rate might be stable, but individual water molecules are always moving in erratic ways. Ergodicity means we can study the average flow and understand the individual molecules. But the researchers here argue that psychological processes, especially related to the self, are often non-ergodic. This means that what we find by studying lots of people at once might not actually tell us much about what's happening within one person changing over time. It is like trying to understand a single person's mood swings by only looking at the average mood of 1,000 people today. You'll miss the whole picture. They're saying we need to focus on the within-person dynamic. So how do you actually study this changing within person self? They suggest moving beyond just looking at explained variance versus unexplained variance in typical statistical models, R² and all that. They believe that what's traditionally called unexplained variance or noise might actually be the most meaningful part, the structured individual context-dependent changes in how we experience ourselves. They propose using methods that can capture this idiographic variance. This means looking at the unique patterns of how different dimensions of experience co-vary within an individual over time. It is not just about the strength of a relationship changing, but the entire configuration of relationships. They highlight methods like ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. This involves collecting data in real time in the actual environment where people live their lives. Imagine getting short questionnaires on your phone throughout the day asking about your feelings, your thoughts, your sense of agency, all in the moment. This creates high-resolution data about how your self-experience fluctuates. Then they suggest using tools like dynamic networks. In this approach, different aspects of your self-experience like agency, ownership, narrative are treated as nodes. In a network, the connections between these nodes called edges represent how they relate to each other over time. So, a strong connection might mean when your sense of agency is high, your sense of ownership also tends to be high. When that connection weakens, your self-experience changes. This allows them to visualize and analyze how these patterns evolve for each individual. They also mention state space models. Think of this like mapping out all the possible states of your self-experience in a multidimensional space. As you move through your day, your self-experience traces a path, a trajectory through this space. Stable states are like comfortable resting places, while unstable ones are areas you might pass through quickly. This helps understand how your self-experience moves between different configurations. To illustrate, they give some heuristic examples. Imagine a coherent self-pattern. This is where the different dimensions are well connected and mutually supportive. Your sense of agency and ownership are tightly linked, creating a solid feeling of "this is me, I am doing this." Your narrative identity acts like a storyteller, weaving these experiences into a coherent life story. In this state, your self-presence, that basic feeling of being there and being yourself, is stable and transparent. In a state space model, this would look like smooth, contained trajectories, moving within a predictable area. You might have brief dips or fluctuations, but you always bounce back to this stable, coherent self-state. Now, what happens when things get a little wobbly? They talk about transient self-destabilizations. For example, maybe you are using a lot of automation, or technology is doing things for you. This could temporarily weaken your sense of agency. In their framework, the connections within the agency dimension might loosen. You might not feel as strongly that "I intended this" or "I controlled that." This could then affect the links to ownership and authorship. Your general self-presence might fluctuate a bit. Authorship, the feeling of being the author of your thoughts and actions, might start to rely more on your reflective, narrative side to try and make sense of things. On the state space map, your trajectory would move away from the stable, coherent area perhaps becoming wider or more erratic, visiting areas of less stability. But ideally, you'd still be able to find your way back to the stable state. The most extreme case they discuss are self-disruptions, where the pattern breaks down more persistently. They often link this to conditions.